Welcome to a guided conversation about Wallingford, Connecticut native son Moses Yale Beach, whose contributions to the world are mostly unsung. Today we are speaking with Valerie Komor, Director of Corporate Archives at the Associated Press, and Professors of American History Menahem Blondheim, joining us from Israel, and Robert E. May, joining from Washington State. To provide our viewers with some context, Moses Yale Beach was born in Wallingford, Connecticut on January 15, 1800, and died in 1868. A man of many skills and innovations, his most successful venture involved the penny newspaper The Sun from 1838 to 1858. He died approximately 3 years after Lincoln was assassinated, while living in his mansion built by architect Henry Austin. In 1838, Beach assumed complete ownership of The Sun by buying out founder and brother-in-law Benjamin H. Day's interest. Under Beach's guidance, The Sun became arguably the most successful daily newspaper in the United States. Beach readily kept in step with the changing technological contexts and ensured The Sun always adjusted and increased its readership and circulations. From employment of steamships, boats, horse express to carrier pigeon, Beach was a man of great faith in all forms of progress, pioneering the employ of steamships and railroads in the collection of news. But it was the work of a neighbor living only a block from the Sun's New York office which inspired in Beach a legitimate wonder. Developed in the 1830s and 1840s by Samuel Morse and other inventors, the telegraph revolutionized long-distance communication. It worked by transmitting electrical signals over a wire laid between stations. In addition to helping invent the telegraph, Samuel Morse developed a code bearing his name that assigned a set of dots and dashes to each letter of the English alphabet and allowed for the simple transmission of complex messages across telegraph lines. Beach was a vocal advocate for the importance of the telegraph. He not only supported the building of necessary infrastructure, but he insisted that there should be no monopoly use of the telegraph by anyone, including the Sun. He truly believed that inventions which brought the world closer together must remain open to all. This ideology came to the fore in the context of the Mexican-American War of 1846 to 1848, when Beach adopted an approach that brought rival newspapers together, including his chief competitors. Beach, being a man of both charisma and common sense, realized that each newspaper, acting only for itself, was needlessly wasting great sums of money. He believed there was a solution to be found and, toward the close of the Mexican-American War, held a meeting in his office at the Sun to discuss steps that could be taken to lessen the waste of money, workforce, and time. Thus, the Sun, the Herald, the Tribune, the Express, and the Journal of Commerce founded the New York Associated Press, designed to cooperate in gathering news. The New York Associated Press has now become a world-embracing establishment for the collection of news of every description, which it furnishes to its members of New York City, as well as the newspapers in every part of the country. Today, the Associated Press carries Beach's enterprising spirit forward into tomorrow as they describe their mission, and I quote, "For 170 years, we have been breaking news and covering the world's biggest stories, always committed to the highest standards of objective, accurate journalism. We were founded as an independent news cooperative and remain owned by our U.S. newspaper and broadcast members, steadfast in our mission to inform the world. From delivering the news via Pony Express in 1846 to working in virtual reality today, we are always innovating." End quote. After the formation of the Associated Press and the end of the Mexican-American War, Moses Y. Beach decided it was time to pass his business into the ready hands of his sons and return home. He was only 58 years old at the time. We will reveal some of our discoveries about Moses Yale Beach and attempt to put his contributions into context for both his time and ours. Our distinguished guests are experts in their respective fields, and their contributions remain, increasingly so, relevant to our contemporary education regarding important events in history not always in the larger public awareness. This is but one reason why we are happy and honored today to be joined by Director Komor and Professors Blondheim and May. Professor Robert May, formerly of Purdue University and now retired, is a specialist in 19th century American history and the author of, among others, Manifest Destiny's Underworld, The Southern Dream of a Caribbean Empire, Slavery, Race, and Conquest in the Tropics, Lincoln Douglas and the Future of Latin America, and Yuletide in Dixie, Slavery, Christmas, and Public Memory. His works contribute renewed understandings of and interventions to knowledge about 19th century American Western expansion. In doing so, Professor May's work alters and enhances our understandings of manifest destiny, underground railroads, and other important focus topics affixed to the antebellum and beyond, and Professor May's recent writing continues to explore the necessity of intervention in nationwide education curriculums. Professor Menahem Blondheim is a faculty member in the Department of Communication and Journalism and the Department of History in the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. His research explores the role of communication in American and in Jewish history, as well as the history of media. A former entrepreneur and executive in the high-tech industry in the dawn of high-speed digital communications, he also studies the development, performance, and meaning of communication technologies, new and old. He has received his BA degree from the Hebrew University, MA and PhD degrees from Harvard University, and has won fellowships from the NEH, Smithsonian Institution, Library of Congress, and the University of Pennsylvania. Professor Blondheim's extensive work in communication and communication histories is, for our purposes, fascinatingly presented in his book News Over the Wires, The Telegraph and the Flow of Public Information in America, 1844 to 1897. Director Valerie Komor is the founding director of the Associated Press Corporate Archives. Before joining AP in 2003, she held positions at the Oberlin College Archives, the Rockefeller Archive Center, the Smithsonian Institution Archives of American Art, and the New York Historical Society. She holds an MA in Medieval Studies from Yale University and an MLIS from the University of Texas at Austin. In 2003, AP Vice President and Director of Corporate Communications, Kelly Tunney, asked Director Komor to establish AP's first corporate archives. According to Director Komor, this offer was a great challenge, as it involved creating a new department and promoting a new idea within the company, the systematic documentation of AP itself. Finally, I am Rian Appelt, an English and Cultural Studies scholar at Stellenbosch University, South Africa. I am interested in the absorbing global histories of media and communication as I pay attention to our contemporary media cycles and usages. Our three guests and their work, you may have noticed, have ties to the subject of our discussion today, namely Moses Yale Beach, a name largely still unrecognized in the public imaginary. Let us begin with how our panelists first encountered Mr. Beach. If I may start with Director Komor, what was your first encounter with Moses Yale Beach?
My first encounter with Moses Yale Beach was actually an encounter with his great-great-grandson, Brewster Yale Beach. And that took place shortly after I arrived at AP, probably in 2004. And Kelly Tunney, then, as you mentioned, head of corporate communications, had already met Brewster Yale Beach, who was really a very interesting man in his own right, but specifically of interest to AP, held a collection of personal papers that he claimed documented the founding of the AP by his great-great-grandfather, Moses Yale Beach. And so as he lived a couple hours north of New York, we drove up to meet him and his wife and spent an afternoon looking over the papers, which he did bring up out of his basement storage area. And we talked about them, and that was really the first time I had ever encountered the name of Moses Yale Beach. And Kelly and I were very, very intrigued. And I thought it was very important to understand exactly what his contribution to the founding of the Associated Press was. So that afternoon, we developed the beginnings of a friendship, and eventually, Brewster Yale Beach came down to visit the AP, and ultimately, we arranged for him to donate those papers to the corporate archives.
May I shift the same question now to Professor Blondheim.
Okay, let me start from the end. My last encounter with the Beaches, Moses Yale the father, Moses Ferry the son. As it turns out, there was a competitor to Mark Twain in writing The Innocents Abroad. Moses Beach visited the Holy Land in the same excursion with Mark Twain and wrote his own memoir, which I started digging into living in Jerusalem as I do. And I discovered more and more on the Beach family affairs at the New York Historical Society, where Valerie, of course, knows very well. And it's a fabulous project, which connected me back to actually my work as a doctoral student. That's where I encountered and how I encountered Beach for the first time. I was looking into the impact of the telegraph, and after a very short while, I discovered that as a common carrier, we simply don't have records that would enable to construct a social history of the American telegraph and telegraphy generally. The one place where we do have records is the use of the telegraph for news reporting, because the telegraphic news reports are recorded in newspapers. So I started looking at newspapers carrying telegraphic news and discovered that actually the telegraph was only a final step in accelerating news, a process that took place in America throughout, but most markedly with the transportation revolution towards the second quarter and in the second quarter of the 19th century. And when you start thinking of speed, of communication, of transmission, Moses Yale Beach just caught my imagination, because the person was involved in rapid transportation and using steam. He was a mechanical genius, I assume. He was interested and involved as an entrepreneur. I mean, he's a Yankee, Connecticut, right? So when he's interested in something, he turns it into an enterprise. So he speed through using steam for transportation, then cheapening paper by creating new techniques and technologies for producing paper using a wood pulp for the first time. And of course, when you look at these technologies, it's immediately associated to the newspaper, to the spreading of news, and telegraphy would be just a natural addition when it comes along, as per your Riyadh, for your introduction.
Thank you very much, Professor Blondheim, and also for just raising a point I'm sure we will find is a recurring one, and that is the point of speed, the speed of modernity. I think that is one we can put a pin in. And finally, Professor May, your first encounter with Moses Yale Beach.
My reflections bridge both of those responses. In the one sense, it was academic in a book. I was in grad school. I got very excited about American territorial expansion, and particularly the philosophy of manifest destiny. And where do you start? Well, you need a background. And there were only a couple of books at that point that had really been written about manifest destiny. And the better one, I think, was by a historian, a Harvard historian by the name of Frederick Merck. And he wrote Manifest Destiny and Mission in American History. And Beach shows up in three spots, as I remember it. He shows up as a key member of the coterie of New York penny newspapers who disseminated expansionist news to the masses, mostly out of New York City, but other East Coast cities like Philadelphia, Baltimore, and Boston. And so that was one place. And then he went on this really surprising mission to Mexico as a State Department secret agent in the US-Mexican War. And that was fascinating. And then I think there was a footnote if I remember right, to Beach's involvement in Cuban projects to add Cuba to the United States when it was a Spanish colony in the 1840s and 1850s. So that was the beginning, and then I hit the archival end of it much later on. So it was really a two-step process. I was in the National Archives one day researching a totally different topic and stumbled upon a woman's letters by the name of Jane Casno. And I'd never heard of her, and she went by a different name when she was closest with Moses Yale Beach. She would be Jane McManus Storm. But at any rate, I ran into this woman, and she went along with Moses Yale Beach on the mission to Mexico. And so I started studying her, and I wound up writing 3 articles about her just because I found the whole idea that women at a time of the supposed cult of domesticity, when women were supposed to stay in the home, raise children, and go to church, I found it just fascinating that she would be on a secret mission to Mexico. And I wound up writing 3 articles about her. There's now a biography about her by the historian Linda Hudson. And when I was doing the research on her, I of course gravitated to the New York Historical Society and saw the Brewster Yale Beach collection. I believe they were copies at the time. There were copies in the New York Historical Society that I was able to use, and they contributed a lot to my writing about Jane Casno. So that's my story.
For our viewers, for some added context, Professor May just dropped some very tantalizing touch points there in terms of Jane Casno, connection to Moses Beach, and also just the word spy. It always generates some kind of excitement. Regarding a glimpse into Beach's life, this can provide a unique lens into the values and cultures of antebellum America, which is rich in parallel to today, from the 1830 Great Cholera Pandemic and our public health response to the COVID pandemic, the opportunities to be self-made, the awakening of industry, a financial crisis tied to decentralizing banks, the rise of a wealth class, and the idea of manifest destiny. Could you kindly provide us with a snapshot of the America the young Mr. Beach was experiencing?
I think very much Moses Yale Beach reflects trends and developments in America at the time. And you could make a case that he's highly representative of them in so many different ways. Americans in the 1830s, 1840s, and maybe closer to the Civil War, before the slavery question consumed the country, Americans thought of themselves as a go-ahead people, that there was something special about them, their sense of enterprise, initiative, and so on. And we can debate forever why Americans felt this way and whether or not they had these kinds of unique characteristics, which can be seen as very ethnocentric. But the fact is that America was founded by a nation of white immigrants. Of course, indigenous peoples were already here. And those white immigrants were for some reason willing to take the gamble of traveling across the Atlantic Ocean at a time when travel was very long and very dangerous, and come to an American continent and start developing what became a nation after the American Revolution. And the immigration persisted right up to the Civil War, right through Moses Yale Beach's time, the 1850s, especially after the potato famines of 1848 and the failed revolutions in Europe, and so on. There were just multitudes of people flocking into the United States. So that was one thing. We were an expanding nation at the time. Most people think of us as expanding westward, but we were expanding in other directions too. For one thing, we were growing from village to city. People were leaving their established lives in their villages with their churches and their extended families, and moving and giving up their farms and moving into cities like New York City. And the amount of growth in New York City, which of course became Moses Yale Beach's base, was staggering. It grew to about 25,000 people per square mile, which was a huge amount back in 1835 or so. And it grew from a population in just the tens of thousands up to many, about 250,000 people before long. And so they're flocking into the cities. They're spreading westward. The cities are developing commercial links with all parts of the world, including Asia, but also especially the Caribbean. And Cuba was one of New York City's. New York City became the commercial hub of the country, and Cuba became a very important part of New York's trade. Overall, in the United States, Cuba was America's third most important trading partner. And there were more Cubans in New York City by the time of the Civil War than all the other Latin American countries put together. Some of them were just coming for their education. Some of them were there for business reasons. It was an immense trade. Ships were leaving New York all the time with barrels and nails and flour and all sorts of American produce, and bringing back, of course, things like sugar and coffee and other products, molasses and things like that from Cuba. And so you have Moses Beach. He's in a city which is booming in population. He comes from an area where technology reigns supreme. If you look at the great inventors of American history, and our inventions were respected all over the world. At the Crystal Palace exhibition in 1851 in London, they raved over things like the Colt revolver and the McCormick Reaper and so on. But virtually every one of the key inventors of the period, except McCormick, who was born in Virginia, virtually all the others, whether you're talking about John Deere, who invented the steel plow, or Samuel Colt, who invented not only the revolving chamber on the revolver, but also the whole principle of interchangeable parts, and Elias Howe, who invented the sewing machine. I could go on, but almost every one of them is from New England. Well, New England was settled by the Puritans, especially, as we know. The Puritans put in the first public education system in America. American education was just exploding, public education, so that about 90% of the population would be literate by the time of the Civil War. I think the literate population in England, as I remember it, and I'd have to look up these statistics, but I think it was around 40%. It's no wonder. So Beach comes from an area where people are very inventive, very enterprising. He moves to a city which is the commercial hub of the Atlantic world. And he moves at a time when the country is expanding greatly in territory. Is it any wonder he becomes an exponent of manifest destiny and American expansion? And there are just countless other ways, I think, you could make the case that Moses Beach reflects his time. But we have to remember, we become a continental nation during his lifetime. When he's born, the country's just in, it's basically at the Appalachian Mountains, and then goes, in the Revolution, it goes out to the Mississippi River. But then it goes all the way across the continent, which leads us to start viewing trade and possibly even possessions. We're already interested in acquiring Hawaii. By the 1850s, there's some initial diplomacy about that. And so, and Alaska too, for that matter. So it's no wonder that Moses Yale Beach became the kind of man he was.
Some extraordinary insights there, and again, a few flashpoints to anticipate in a follow-up conversation, particularly your thoughts on geographical direction as linked to to the expansion. That's not necessarily strictly the Western expansion. To come back to the notion of speed, which somewhat finds itself in the undercurrent of this question. Innovation included the birth of communications. And for those of us carrying a phone in our pocket, how are our communication experiences today rooted in the emergence of the telegraph and the penny paper?
I think when it comes to the penny paper, it is more experiential. Speaking about the telegraph, I think it's more conceptual and maybe ideological, in the sense that from times immemorial until the telegraph, communication and transportation were the same thing in effect. To get information, you needed some carrier to bring that information from a distance to yourself, to where you were. The telegraph created the separation of transportation from knowledge, from information. And that is probably the most significant change in communications since perhaps the printing press, or maybe even greater than that. Once we didn't have the concept of communication until the telegraph appeared, or quite a few years after it appeared. The editor, competing editor in New York, said that the telegraph creates a whole new class of ideas, I'm quoting, a new species of consciousness. The fact that these religious notions of omnipresence, of being at two places at the same time, of things happening in all kinds of places, as if guided from some unique, different alter existence, that all begins with the telegraph. So this is, in a deep sense, the telegraph really changes the way we think of the world and the way we think of information. The main aspect of the telegraph, though it's paradoxical, you don't see anything moving, you don't get the sense of speed at all from the telegraph, but the telegraph comes to a nation in which speed was being revolutionized just shortly before the appearance of the telegraph. River navigation speeded up 500% in the 2 decades before the telegraph. It was 3 months to get from New Orleans to Chicago. Once Chicago was established, with steam, these times were shortened by hundreds of percent. And with the telegraph, overnight, distances just no longer existed when it came to information. But the way a person got that notion, got that feeling, was through reading his newspaper. In fact, it wasn't necessarily reading the newspaper. And perhaps the most significant aspect of the penny press revolution that began with the Sun appearing in 1833 was the fact that news, information, events that are happening and concern everyone suddenly appeared in the public sphere. If previously you read your newspaper, the news came to your doorstep with a delivery of a newspaper you subscribed to, with the penny press and the marketing revolution of street sales, information became part of the rough and tumble of every day. You heard what New Yorkers considered the news-crying nuisance. The newspaper vendors screamed the headlines in the street to entice people to buy the newspaper. The fact that the newspaper could be sold not by subscription, but by the unit, forced editors to constantly bring new information. So if at the beginning people like Moses Yale Beach, who wasn't or Benjamin Day, in fact, but later Beach too, they realized people were thrilled by new information about the world, about things they didn't know previously. So they started collecting local news, which wasn't really previously newspaper material. They went to courts, they went to hospitals, they went to the fire department to hear where there were fires, they went to the courts to hear new proceedings of trials that caught the people's fancy. They brought news just by walking around town. These people who weren't well connected, the news didn't come from the outside in, from networks of financial experts or networks of politicians. They picked up the news from strolling through town that, as Professor May explained, where towns were and cities were growing constantly. There was more happening, and people were curious about this kind of information. And the fact that you had news in the public sphere, it caught. Now, when you have a newspaper sold on the streets, you could publish a number of editions a day. By subscription, it's one edition in the morning. You get a piece of news. Okay, it waits 24 hours until it gets published. But if you can sell in the streets, any new bit of information can immediately be printed, published, and brought to the public. So you walk in Chatham Square in New York, and every few hours you hear new information, new news. So your consciousness of change is alerted immediately. You buy another newspaper, and of course, editors understood they're capitalists. They put their money where they believe their sales are, and they started investing tens of thousands of dollars in speeding news, using special ships, using pony expresses and so forth to speed the news. There was a tremendous return on investment in speeding the news. And that is, of course, the background for the significance of the telegraph to the New York press and to the notions of the shrinking distances and the shrinking lengths of time in that period.
I just have to add a cultural artifact as kind of a point on Professor Blondheim's remarks a minute ago. It seems to me that the painting by Richard Woodville, The War News from Mexico, comes in so nicely on this. It shows a bunch of people in front of a building, a small wooden building called the American Hotel, and they're on the front steps and they're reading and talking about the war news from Mexico. It's just arrived, probably by the system that Moses Yale Beach set up.
The palpable sense of rush is definitely captured in Professor Blondheim's book, News on the Wire. Let's go back to Moses Beach himself. How critical are Mr. Beach's preoccupations with fast and verifiable news to the Associated Press today?
First of all, in our discussion of speed and its origin, and speed as a way of doing greater business, but also giving people what they want, timely and new information, the AP still does that. Speed is an ideal, of course. It is not, however, the primary ideal. You could think of the evolution of accuracy along with speed as being kind of a joint ideal of the Associated Press. And of course, those twin ideals are not limited to AP as far as the news goes, but the notion of pairing accuracy with speed developed over time. And I would say that probably this sense of, get it first, but first get it right, comes after about 1900. So as the culture within the organization matures, and a kind of a sense of how do we want to present ourselves and what indeed are the most important goals or what is our chief mission, I think you'll find that accuracy kind of climbs past speed.
Professor May, credible news during the Mexican War meant receiving reports from journalists like Jane Storm. Can you share what you know of her connection to the Sun and comment on her influences and biases?
Regarding Jane Storm and her connection with the sun, Jane Storm's had a very colorful pre-Sun life, you might say. She was the daughter of a man who became a New York congressman. He was a lawyer and a merchant, and the family hit some apparently fairly hard economic times, and they got involved in Texas land speculations. And her father knew Aaron Burr, who of course had long since killed Alexander Hamilton, and he sent Jane, who at the time was unmarried, off to see Burr, and the details of the land speculations in Texas are too mind-boggling for me to get into on a short program. But she wound up spending much of the 1830s in either Texas or New York, and a large share of it in Texas, where she lived for a while. Met at Gorda. She met her future husband, William Casno. She got to know many of the leaders of what became the Republic of Texas, and then the state of Texas. President Mirabeau Bonaparte Lamar, Sam Houston, all sorts of important Texas figures, and eventually wrote about them in the magazine, The Democratic Review, and published a thing called The Presidents of Texas. And anyway, she had this long career in Texas, back and forth, at one point she takes a bunch of German settlers down, trying to settle them on some of her land claims near Waco, Texas. They refuse to go inland, so that enterprise fails. And she and her future husband play a major role in Texas's early history. He will serve in the Texas legislature and so on, and help draft the Texas Constitution. But to make a long story short, when she's pretty much done with the Texas scene, which is where I think she absorbs a lot of her knowledge of Mexico, because Texas at the time, up to the Texas Revolution, is a part of Mexico, and she moves to New York. She has a little bit of time in the Mediterranean area, reporting for Horace Greeley's New York Tribune, and traveling all over the Mediterranean. And then she comes and settles into a life as a journalist in New York. And Beach is just part of a whole circle of magazines and newspapers that she writes for under various pseudonyms. So she often goes as Montgomery. That way people don't know you're a woman, and you might be more likely to get published. Sometimes Cora Montgomery, sometimes Jane Maria McManus, all sorts of different names, occasionally using her full name, Jane Storm, she did marry at one point to a man named Alan Storm. And I might mention along the way that she was named in the Burr divorce suit. Apparently, Burr was caught in a sexual act with her, and it was a major issue in Aaron Burr's divorce trial, which was finished up right before Burr died. So that's another funny story. I mean, she is really quite a case. But at any rate, she writes for all these different newspapers. And to the best of my knowledge, she starts writing for Moses Yale Beach's New York Sun in 1843. And then she gets much more deeply involved with the Sun around the time Texas annexation becomes an important issue in 1845. And writes quite a bit for the Sun, but she's also writing for John O'Sullivan's Democratic magazine and others, the Baltimore Sun. She's a rather remarkable woman, and she will keep up her contact with the Sun after the mission with Beach. She will continue writing for it. She will develop perhaps an even closer relationship with Beach's son, Moses Sperry Beach, because if you read the papers of the Brewster Beach family collection, there seems to me to be a closer connection with Moses Sperry Beach in the later years of her involvement with the son. After Beach gives up the day-to-day editing of the Sun to his son, so it's all a very interesting relationship. That I mean, obviously, I could give a lot more details on Jane Storm, but I think that's the broad outline of it.
Moving back to you, Director Komor, can you comment on war coverage and the evolution of the AP?
I think it's probably no surprise that Beach would have wanted to speed the news of the war in Mexico to his readers. There was a great clamor for news of the war. These things just came together for him. He understood that there was a delay in the transmission of the news dispatches that arrived across the Gulf of Mexico from Veracruz to Mobile and then onward to Montgomery. That Mobile-Montgomery leg tended to delay the news, probably because of the difficulty getting horses or getting, moving across that particular leg. So, in hiring a rider who would get those dispatches from Mobile to Montgomery and then onto the Great Southern Mail coaches, which would take those dispatches to Richmond, which was then the southern terminal of the telegraph. He was trying to solve a very real time problem by uniting several different technologies, of course, as we've discussed, the boat, the horse, and linking them up to the new technology of the telegraph. So I think the war simply provided the impetus for that information, but the Associated Press covers war as it covers any news. So there's no mystery as to why the Associated Press sends reporters to war zones and always has, because somebody has to go and be witness to conflict in order to tell the rest of the world about it. Now, clearly, over the decades and in the intervening centuries, the technology has gone on changing, and the standards and protocols for war reporting have also changed. So, whereas Vietnam was a war that most journalists who covered it look back on with great wonder at how relatively easy it was to get out to the battlefield. That hasn't always been the case, particularly with the more recent conflicts where journalists are typically embedded, as was the case in Iraq and in the Gulf War. But not to get too far afield from our discussion, you could write volumes about AP's war coverage, but it has always been, central, and it's always been a very, very expensive part of AP's budget. Just for example, in Ukraine right now, that's another example. Wars are expensive to cover because you're very concerned about the security of your reporters. You don't want to tire them out, so you have staff that you have to rotate in and rotate out. I mean, it's a hugely, hugely demanding but essential part of any news operation, and the AP is no different.
Can you comment on the social, economic, and political forces that Mr. Beach leveraged So here I think of paper processing, banking, editorial roles, the post office, and so on.
Yes, he was a one-man empire of communications in many ways. If I may, before turning back to Moses Beach, comment on two things that Valerie raised. One is accuracy. And of course, we must not forget that the AP, given telegraphic technology, which is a broadcast technology, basically, the way the AP used it, right? It's like this great hourglass of news coming in, funneling into New York headquarters from all over the country, being sifted, edited, and then broadcast in one writing to every nook and corner in the United States. To every newspaper gets its news in one writing from the Associated Press. Obviously, the more accurate you are at the source, the impact on accuracy throughout the country is tremendous. Let's add to that the AP throughout most of its, at least the 19th century, was a monopoly. So it did have the luxury of sufficient time, because it had no competitors, to be accurate. And I think that's a wonderful gift that we got from the more problematic aspects of being a monopoly of knowledge in the 19th century. Wars. The Civil War, the big 19th century war, the AP had very little expenses in covering it. In fact, it did much less in the field than any of its member newspapers or most large newspapers in the United States. Because it was a monopoly, it got the direct information from the government. Lincoln lived in the telegraph office during the Civil War, and the information about the war coming through the wires of the field telegraph, the army telegraph, the military telegraph to Washington were concentrated in Washington. The Union gave its authoritative news to the Associated Press to be spread throughout the United States. Hence, the Gettysburg Address goes out, is given immediately to the Associated Press for spreading throughout the country. So this is a monopoly that has a very close relationship with the administration. It's in fact, Lincoln didn't even go to the trouble of establishing an administration newspaper, as was common before him. He had the Associated Press. Now, part of the beauty of it is no one realized this. AP reports were always anonymous. They didn't carry a dateline or the name of the correspondent. This was, Professor May, this was pretty current with reporters, unlike correspondents. And there you have the problem of pseudonyms if the correspondent happened to be a woman. But the news spread throughout the Union. No one knew exactly where they came from. And Lincoln could just impress the first news on the nation the way he wanted. For the Associated Press, that was a tremendous bane. Of course, in other wars, it was more difficult. And one additional problem, most of the wars America participated in after the Civil War were held abroad. And the issue of secrecy and the freedom of the press was not a great issue when you're reporting from Europe and the news, the news is happening very far away from the battlefield, and there is a significant delay. Consider, even in Vietnam, a major source were videos being sent from there. So there's a complexity to this news reporting, and AP tried to do its best and most effective in different mixes of media that we spoke of. What was your question again, Rian? I went on and on in response to.
To some extent, you have answered part of my question. Thank you, Prof. Blondheim. It was, to repeat, it was just asking any commentary you might have had on the social, economic, and political forces that Moses Y. Beach leveraged in his time. And to some extent, I felt you touched upon that, but if you'd like to elaborate, please go ahead.
Okay, I'll try to be short, but I think we have to think of the political aspect as pretty separate. The penny press is given credit for inaugurating a press that is not politically influenced by the establishment of a kind of a free press. To an extent, it is correct. However, the press prior to the penny press was also pretty independent in the sense that editors, or let's put it differently, the penny press, the Sun less than others, but was usually politically opinionated. But it wasn't funded by the party. It was private enterprise, and you could always hear some refreshing new ideas coming from the press and the deep sense of public opinion of the 19th century, which is not as today kind of feedback, how many people support or not support. It was opinions coming from the bottom up, percolating up from the people to government, to administrations, to elites. And in that sense, the penny press was truly a medium of public opinion, bringing open, fresh ideas to the marketplace of ideas, and then they funneled up into the political debate. Economically, the role of Beach and the penny press and this collaboration around the Telegraph, which is the Associated Press, created perhaps the most significant democratization of markets in American history. So we're already in the Jacksonian period tending towards a market economy, but insiders had advantage in acquiring, in holding, in working on the basis of inside information. People who had networks of correspondence were the first, got letters from their colleagues, and were the first to know the economic conditions and act accordingly in the markets. So the press always came in second. If you based your information on what came in the newspaper, this is after all the traders already speculated in the market, you had nothing to gain. Once the telegraph became, which was the fastest means of communication, and given New York's incorporation law, they were given priority to spread financial news. The first news that anyone got in America were from the Associated Press, news from Europe, news from the markets. So there was a tremendous, given the Associated Press serving the public and not insiders, it was a tremendous force of leveling opportunities and in America. And that created the possibility of an open market economy in which people could be mobile, like Moses Yale Beach was. He moved up very fast, became very wealthy, and wrote about these wealthy people of America, seeing that new money and old money could reach the same heights in a very, very short period of time. So that's about politics, that's about economics, and that's about Moses Yale Beach.
Can each of you comment on the challenges and importance of primary sources and the irony that Mr. Beach's date of birth is inaccurately recorded in most references because it was reported in his New York Times obituary incorrectly?
Okay, I have a wonderful anecdote about this, which came from my interaction with Valerie Komor. I knew about the Moses Beach Memorandum, which is our main piece of evidence for establishing the date of the Associated Press and the process of its establishment. My colleague, as a student in grad school, Steve Jaffe, worked on the Brewster Beach paper. He was working on New York journalism and knew I was working on the wire services. He found this document in the Brewster Beach papers. I wrote an article, I think 50 pages, Valerie. I shared it with you, dating the Associated Press based on the Beach Memorandum. A main aspect feature of that paper, of that article, was dating the Beach Memorandum. When was it written? And I gave this lecture with this great discovery of concluding when the Beach Memorandum was authored. And Valerie took it nonchalantly. She said, yeah, of course. Turns out, Steve Jaffe gave me a copy of the Beach Memorandum that he Xeroxed. Valerie had the full document, And the date of writing the document was on the verso, was on the back of that page, which I had to write 50 pages and work for I don't know how long on trying to figure out when the document was written. Valerie had the document and she knew immediately. She knew it from the word go.
That document, you turn it over and it says June/72, death of Bennett. So immediately you kind of picture the son of Moses Yale Beach, Moses Sperry Beach, who authored this little recollection of the founding of the Associated Press. And you realize that he probably sat down after the death of the Sun's great rival editor, James Gordon Bennett, in June of 1872, to set the record straight, or to fix permanently his understanding of his father's contribution, which that memorandum does very, very precisely. And so that is something that the archivist, having the physical paper, has the luxury to do, to handle the physical item and to make that physical item available to historians like you both to study and increase the sum of our understanding. But it is, so that little story is repeated probably thousands of times, day in and day out, as we struggle to either make out handwriting that is not clear, or make out a scan on microfilm that has been poorly photographed, so that an A looks like an E or a C. Meanwhile, you're going blind trying to figure out what letter it really is. And then just people make mistakes. Journalists make mistakes. Diarists, correspondents, people are human, and so they remember incorrectly, or they make things up as they go along to cover ignorance, or they hazard guesses. So there really is, there's absolutely no surprise from this archivist anyway, that a date of birth might have gotten off by a week. I can think of many, many reasons why that would have happened. And it's really funny that Menahem tells that story, because when I read the list of questions and saw that, I thought, we could tell that story.
I was going to say that I could tell it too, because when first of all historians, if they're smart, I think, and this is certainly advice I'd give to grad students, find a topic to study where there are good primary sources. To give you an example, when I was trying to figure out what to do after my first book came out of my doctoral dissertation. I had a topic that had all been mapped out in grad school, but now I had to find something on my own. And I decided I wanted to write another book that had something to do with American expansion. And I got, one of the topics that most intrigues me is these filibusters who were American private citizens who formed military expeditions to conquer foreign countries in the period before the Civil War. And one of those filibusters conquered Nicaragua. His name was William Walker. It's a fascinating story. But I had already seen most of the Walker primary sources, that is to say, letters, and you always hope for diaries, but they're often not there. They were pretty dull and bland. And they were very businesslike. He might say in a letter to one of his associates when planning an expedition to Nicaragua, make sure you've got the boat ready to go at 7 o'clock. Walker, and they'd be short, cryptic sentences, didn't tell much of his life, his feelings, his family, anything like that. And so I just decided, what could I add to the established record? Not much. So I kept looking, and I was probing around the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, and I found a letter collection from another prospective filibuster topic, John Quitman, who was, I knew he was the Mexican War hero who led U.S. troops into Mexico City during the U.S.-Mexican War. I knew he had been Mississippi's leading secessionist. But what I didn't know was that there was this really wonderful collection of his private letters to his son at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. So I decided, I think I'll go with this. And later on, I found some diary fragments and things like that. And it turns out there were Quitman collections all over the United States. And so I had probably 10, 20 times as many primary sources. And I wrote a 400-page book. I don't know what I could have said that much new about William Walker. That's one thing. So I think primary sources are essential to writing good histories. And it also helps differentiate many popular histories or commercial histories, we might say, which reevaluate what past historians have written to come up with new interpretations and what important new work is. But second of all, in the case of Quitman, here's where the link comes in with the Beach story. I was trying to figure out when Quitman was born, and it turned out there's this prior 2-volume synthesis. It's got some of his letters. It's part biography. It's partly the study of Mississippi history by J.F.H. Claiborne, who was one of his close friends. So he had written before the Civil War a book about John Quitman, who died shortly before the Civil War. And Claiborne says very carefully, and this is by one of Quitman's own friends, that Quitman was born in 1798. So when I wrote my first publication on Quitman, which was just an article, I had the wrong birthday. And luckily, in doing research on him before I got the book done, I traveled to Rhinebeck, New York, which was his birthplace. And my family and I went probing around, reading cemetery inscriptions, and we found the Quitman family plot. And there on the gravestone, I found that John Quitman was born a year later in 1799. So luckily, I got that information at least in time for my book. We're all embarrassed by errors in books, and most books have at least 1 or 2 errors somewhere in them, and we try to minimize them. So that's definitely a link. And what I would add to the reflections here are that that these days we have so many ways to check things. You can join Ancestry.com and get all sorts of census material without even going to the libraries and reading the microfilm reels and that kind of thing. It was much harder years ago when I was starting out as a historian. There are wonderful encyclopedias today of all sorts that are easy reference. And of course, the web and Google help. And yes, there's a lot of misinformation on the web, but there are so many sources that a careful scholar can, start checking things against each other. Google Books can help out in many cases. Internet Archive's another web source. There are just so many ways to get the story straight today. So that's a roundabout way of saying, yes, primary sources are essential. The primary sources are tricky, and if you want to get the story right, you've got to try your best to be meticulous.
Please.
First of all, Professor May's final point raises really some significant concerns. How will the historians of the future document our own era? And I'm just throwing that out, but we can, spend the 3 of us, the 4 of us, tremendous amount of time on, pondering this issue, which is there, which leads me to more very quick AP stories or AP history stories. One is of that vein. Maybe Valerie can help me out with the story, but I was working on, I was very generously granted permission to use the AP president's letter books that were at AP headquarters at the time, sorry, at the Western Union president's letter books, which were located in Upper Saddle River, where Western Union's headquarters were. And the corporate secretary was very generous. I spent 2 or 3 weeks there at an office, and then I had to come back because there were some things I really had to look up after processing the information. And they used these files, these president's letter books, as live documents because there were issues of real estate, rights of way underground, and so on for telegraph wires that were still relevant. So they were in this kind of safe, the size of the room I'm sitting in. And she arranged, Margaret Jasko, the Western Union corporate secretary at the time, arranged a small table for me in the safe. Mm-hmm. And she pointed out that above my head was this giant manila envelope, and she said, "Oh, it was full of seals. It was sealed by the Supreme Court. These were all the telegrams coming in and out of Dallas, Texas, in I think the week or the month before and after the Kennedy assassination." But the Warren Committee Western Union wouldn't hand in the telegrams because it said it was, private correspondence and the right of privacy. And the commission wanted the documents to find Kennedy's murderer. And it was decided not to allow the reading of the telegrams, but that Western Union had the schedule of destroying documents because it couldn't keep all copies of all telegrams forever. So the documents would be preserved but not perused, and they would be in the custody of Western Union's corporate secretary. So there I was sitting alone in the safe with the answer to the question, who assassinated Kennedy, right above my head. Now, I don't know whatever happened to those documents. I'm still curious, but since I'm a 19th century historian and not 20th century, I guess someone else is concerned with that. That's one IP story. Another one actually draws the arrow in the opposite direction. I was working on the bogus proclamation in the Civil War, which was the incident that's significant because it was the greatest threat on freedom of the press and the freedom of speech in America during the war. Lincoln actually ordered closure of 2 New York newspapers, the only time in his career. He was extremely liberal. And I built a theory about what happened there when clearly it was a New York hoax. Someone tried to make money fast and said there was a union debacle and expected the prices of gold to go up. And this was a fabrication in New York. But Lincoln insisted that it originated, the fabrication, the hoax, it originated in Washington. And my theory was that he actually wrote a proclamation to that effect, but didn't issue it yet. And someone he suspected went into his office, found this document and publicized it without authorization. So this is real treason. And the theory remained, but I couldn't prove it. And I started looking in every possible Lincoln archive, any archive that had any documents by Lincoln. And ultimately, I found it in a tiny collection in Indiana. I think they had 5 Lincoln original autograph letters in which Lincoln actually wrote that same night of the bogus proclamation order to call to duty 300,000 men, which indicated failure in the war. So that's sometimes you can go the opposite way and actually research can try to establish something but then only real authentic documents can prove it, can authenticate it. Again, the question is, what do we do today, tomorrow, in this era of fleeting bits and bytes and information transpiring into this?
We're always catching up with history. So is there a particular insight about how he may have wanted to influence his world, his time?
Probably what strikes me the most is how representative he was of a kind of almost a consensus feeling among many of the New York newspapermen, especially O'Sullivan, who we worked with quite a bit, and yet they were rivals. And O'Sullivan claimed that Beach's circulation wasn't as high as Beach claimed it was, and so on. So there was a real rivalry between them, but they both seemed to have a real sensitivity that America had to be a country for the working people, and that they had a role in fulfilling that. And it was a mission that Jane Casno joined in many of her columns for both of them. And that the country had to grow, and it had to prosper, and that it had to spread Republican institutions. In a sense, they were descendants of Thomas Jefferson. Neither of their newspapers were supposedly partisan, and yet they really were Democratic mouthpieces, despite their independence. And I think that Professor Blondheim got at that a little bit in his comments, that you have, in those days, you had subsidizing going on with a lot of the press, and they got printing contracts, for instance. They got a lot of their money that way. But Beach and O'Sullivan and others depended on daily sales, often on the streets. And so there was real democratic impulse that they were trying to spread throughout the continent, maybe extended to Latin America. I think they shared this. And they also shared, I think, a kind of weakness on the slavery question. That is to say, neither of them and many Democratic newsmen wanted to see the slavery question ruin the republic for all whites, including middling whites, working people, and so on, that they were trying to promote. And so they tended to suppress the slavery issue as much as they could. When Jane Casno wrote on Texas, she promoted the idea of a transsectional land. Robert J. Walker, who was really a northerner, became a Mississippian, and then when he crossed both sections, and he promoted this theory of the safety valve, that if you have Texas, it'll be a safety valve for America's slavery question, that slavery will gradually siphon off from the southern states into Texas and then into Latin America, and it can all be resolved without a war and without disunion. And so I think that was the primary goal of both Beach and O'Sullivan and others in their circle. And the problem is it sends a mixed message to today, because I'm struck in particular by an editorial that I read of Beach's. It was I think labeled dated 1847, in which he essentially said that slavery was abhorrent. Those were his words. But he was writing as a correspondent from New Orleans, who was on his way back from his Mexican mission. And he said it's abhorrent, and then he goes on in the next sentence and talks about the cleanliness of the New Orleans slave pen or slave jail. And so there's kind of an ambiguity there. So just to summarize one more time the point, I think they were trying to promote a greater republic and greater democracy for American whites, and to expand it while also warding off the threat of civil war over the issue of slavery.
As you reflect on the motivations that changed journalism in the 19th century, are there any lessons for today?
A major tension that I think we face and have been facing since the mid-19th century is between our hope for cohesiveness, having a general public agenda that can unite people in New York in the first phase, and then all Americans, and then all people of the world, and so forth. We're looking for some kind of unity, for closeness, for dependence, for interdependence, for being on the same page with the people around us in our neighborhood, in our city, in our country, in the world. And when we look back at things that pioneers like Moses Yale Beach accomplished, it's tremendous and it's gratifying. Having people who previously could not afford to buy newspapers or wouldn't go to the trouble because it wasn't interesting enough, being part and sharing the pulse and the feelings and the events and this experience of manifest destiny, this idea is spread by O'Sullivan through that Professor Maynard was speaking about. So this unity, this cohesion, this one nation with some differences, but that can be debated, and art can be debated in the public sphere. We long for it in a sense, especially in this age of fake news, of tweets and posts and disinformation and horrible kinds of content and materials that are spread, and you don't know when many people trust, though they are not trustworthy. The responsibility of people like Beach, as citizens, as mass media owners, is something we, in a sense, miss. We long for it. But there is the other side of the tremendous power which these people they acquired. I mean, they could determine almost the fate of American participation in the Spanish-American War, because there was one narrow conduit that Valerie described, going from ship to a Pony Express to telegraph wire. There was one version of the truth. There was one version of the world. And that is scary, a monopoly of knowledge. So I think we live this tension between our wish to be informed, to be part of the public, of having this combination of news, of information and people, and having all of us share the same information environment. We long for that, but then we really want the diversity. We want this Uncle Tom's Cabin coming out of nowhere and completely transforming America. So I think that in many ways these tensions remain throughout the ages, and Moses Yale Beach was like the peak, the epitome of one movement towards massification, towards participation, towards a knowledgeable electorate, and one America uniting from all its parts, and that's what the AP did. It was the first national non-government organization in America. So that's a tremendous accomplishment on the one hand, but we should be aware of its downside too.
I just wanted to pick up on the notion of the preservation of this news that Professor Blondheim and Professor Menahem have already described, in terms of the challenges that the archival community faces. On the one hand, to preserve the journalism that and the administration of that journalism, to preserve the record of all that, but also, of course, that we preserve the writing of news at all. That we continue to try to work to, excuse me, well, I'll let that go. The question of the educated citizenry, the question of being able to read, to respond, to fulfill our roles as a citizen, by becoming informed readers of the news, and all of that has been really is now up for grabs, I think, in the culture. And so the work of preservation and education, I think, go hand in hand.
I'm struck by the wisdom of your comments, both of your comments, and that we're in an age. It's very funny looking back on the antebellum period, the period before the Civil War, when there's so many things to despise. Labor unions were suppressed, indigenous people were warred on and discriminated against and had their lands taken away, and they weren't considered citizens. We attacked foreign nations. Really, the Mexican War was 90%, I think, U.S.'s fault, and we were looking for new territory. There are a lot of things, and then you tack onto it enslavement throughout much of the country, and women's rights were just beginning to get talked about and pushed, but obviously had a long ways to go before women's suffrage and things like that. So you can go on and on like that. But for all the bad things, you did have an expanding news media, and it went up. The number of daily newspapers, I think, went up from about 25 daily newspapers early in the century, and it's up to 250 or 300, I think, by around the time of the Civil War. And at any rate, citizens could have access to news locally. Many cities and towns had newspapers representing both parties, and we were getting to a point where we're getting even some of our best newspapers are either going online, they're getting too expensive for poor people to buy, declining circulations. The New York Times is obviously a kind of a paper that's bucked that trend, but we have to, I think, be very wary of a society without a truly enlightened press where extremists of any persuasion can seize far more believers online, with podcasts and so on, and where people aren't getting balanced news. And the Associated Press, throughout its long history, has, I think, striven to promote balanced news. And I'm very concerned about where we're heading on all this.
Is there something in the AP archive, in his own words, in Moses Beach's own words, that can give us insight into his contribution to the world?
Well, to be completely truthful, there is nothing in the papers of Mr. Beach that quote him directly. So we are somewhat at a loss because we don't have. I mean, when you consider that he lived from 1800 to 1868, but nothing survives. And that's the key word, that nothing survives in his hand, which is the only place we would find anything that he had written. So the only thing we have are the recollections of his son, Moses Sperry Beach. But as you can imagine, that's indirect. So we don't know. We have a beautiful oil portrait of Moses Yale Beach, which was probably done sometime while he was at the New York Sun between 1835 and 1848. He is probably about 40 years old or 50 years old. He's in the pink of health. He looks very, very pleased with himself, very successful, and sort of riding the wave of destiny. And, to me, that's the closest thing to speech that I find. As I said, apart from the recollections of his family, that portrait speaks to me every time I see it.
Perhaps I may interject that a picture can speak of 1,000 lost words. Once again, my thank you to all three of you for your time and for this most illuminating conversation. It's been an absolute pleasure and joy and privilege to hear your insights, your shared wisdoms, and to also hear how you engage among one another about these very valuable and really, in fact, timeless topics. So thank you very much.